Engaging with a consultant is a complicated and sometimes expensive process. So, how do you make sure that your engagement is successful, that your organization really gets good value, and that everybody leaves with a good experience and a great product? Today, we're going to talk about how to work successfully with your consultants. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting. Today, we are talking about how to work with consultants. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Cynthia Rojas and Rebecca Tuttle. Good morning.
Hi, how are you, Peta?
Good to see you. I want to welcome all of our listeners. If you are joining us live, please let us know your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. And I also especially want to welcome our listeners around the world and in Australia. So, you guys, today we're talking about how to work with somebody like us. Big undertaking, right? And the first question is, how do you even know like this is an appropriate project to work with a consultant on, right? What's the difference between something you should do with a consultant and something you can handle internally?
That's a great question. Usually my first gauge is I'll listen to them describe the project and ask if they've given any thought about how they would like the project to go or look or be, and what some of their anticipated outcomes are. And if they're able to describe them in a way that I feel I can offer a compliment to that, then that's probably a right fit project. Mm-hmm. If it's a project where they say, well, we hadn't really thought about that, or, we're not quite ready yet, but hope to be, then I might advise them to come back when they are ready.
Yeah.
Because this might be a project where they're looking more for a staff person rather than a consultant, where a consultant doesn't do the work of the staff person.
All right, that is super important. I want to talk about that. I also want to highlight and amplify something else you said that was really important, which was you can articulate the deliverables. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know specific things that you want to get out of this engagement. All right, now let's talk about the other really, really important things, which is the difference between what a consultant can work on and what a staff person can work on. So what are some of those differences?
So I teach and write grants, and I'm a fund development consultant, but I am not your grant writing staff person. So I don't go to staff meetings unless we're working on the project and it's applicable. I don't clock in and out like a regular employee would. There's a lot of differences in terms of, well, you see this in the contract is that it's work for hire. You see those terms, right. Work for hire. And if it reads as though you are being employed in that position versus offering your expertise in consultation, there's usually a clear delineation, but it has to be written in the contract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important thing. The consultant is only working on that set of deliverables that the consultant has been hired for. So they're not available for other stuff around the office, right? They're really not part of that team. And that includes things like we are not going to sit in on a meeting just in case, right?
Right. And everything's usually scheduled out. And, so for example, I have weekly coaching calls with my clients. We update the project. We gather any information that we need. And also I report back out on them. The other delineation is in your contract, it will state the accountability for the consultant and the accountability for the client. Yeah. So what they will provide to be able to allow the consultant to perform the work. And also, if this work is not provided, the consultant cannot provide this work. So a lot of it is spelled out in the contract. So my recommendation is that you read the contract that the consultant provides to you thoroughly. And if you have any questions, that before you sign on with that consultant, that you discuss those and get them out of the way, because once it's signed, that's what both are accountable to.
Right.
And projects get messy when you have to shift those deliverables, as you're saying, in the middle of a project, and technically it voids out that contract and you should write a new.
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah,
I have to say that there are times, so this is different from a consultant, but sometimes I would help an organization implement something so that they can then take it on. And that's a really interesting, it's more contract work. It's really interesting to me because the lines get blurred sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I find with organizations is that when they have a consultant, their part of their work kind of starts to dwindle as time goes by. I don't know if the two of you have that experience, but Rebecca, you saying putting that in the contract is essential. And I do, and it is really important. But what happens is that organizations are dealing with day-to-day stuff. And I have found that when they're doing that and they have someone like me on board, they tend to think that they don't have to keep their part of the equation, or they forget that this is a two-way street.
I've learned that a really crucial part of my job as the consultant is managing the client and making sure that they know every week what they need to be doing, as well as what I am doing. Yeah. Project management is on the consultant, right? So when you have a staff person and you've given them responsibilities, they might have a supervisor who helps them move those processes forward. The consultant is going to do that, right? For the project. And that means the consultant is going to manage the client and the client's staff with respect to that project.
And there are elements of flexibility. So for example, in my contracts, I actually write out the dates that we will be meeting for our coaching calls, the number of calls, the topics of the calls. And, if a client doesn't show up, then do we reschedule? Or, because life happens, especially with everything with COVID, right? So you have to be flexible. But if they're historically not showing up and your contract is for 8 weeks and you have deliverables, but you can't deliver because you didn't have that time to gather the information. So what do you do? Instead of talking about it in the moment, I look at it like a grant. If a funder awarded you funds and you said you would serve 50 people, but by week 11, you only served 10, you have to give those funds back unless you have a really clear explanation. So up front is when you would decide or discuss rather with your client as a consultant that if you don't show for this many appointments or without canceling or whatever, these are the next steps. Because what you really want to avoid are surprises, because it can be damaging to your reputation, to the project itself, and nobody wants that.
No, right. And nobody, I always say like, there's somebody who brought me into this organization and they talked their boss and their organization into making a pretty substantial investment. So their reputation is on the line too, right?
Right.
Yeah. I think that it's just as important. Peter, you mentioned you manage clients. It's just as important for clients to manage their consultants and really be available to them, orient them. I like to hear about organizational culture. It's part of my kickoff meetings because one, if we have an organization that people blow off meetings and that's part of the culture, I need to know that, right? And so there are all kinds of things that I think organizations can do to actually have a really good, successful relationship.
Yeah.
The other piece too is, so a lot of my clients, I'll have contract work as a consultant, but also have retainer work. So that works a little bit different, and that's not part of our episode today. But the parameters aren't so much looser, but they're more flexible because there's a consistency to the project, for example, if a retainer goes throughout the end of the year, then the expectations and deliverables might change a little. So it really just depends on the needs of the organization. And then is it a right fit for that consultant and the organization to partner together? And then what does that work look like? Now, the other component too is in my work, we work a lot with grant deadlines. So that also has to be spelled out because, you know, as we approach a deadline, it could be catastrophic for an organization if we don't submit in time or, you know, something goes wrong. So spelling that out as much as you can. But there's also a tremendous element of risk that organizations take investing, as Peter said, into consultants, oftentimes when they have small budgets. So you, as the consultant, we really want to reassure you all that, you know, we can do this work for you. And if we aren't able to, just being upfront and transparent about that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get that. I get that. Oh, there was a question that left my brain. It'll come back.
It'll come right back. So let's talk about, let's talk about best practices in communicating with your consultant.
Oh, I love it. Yes.
Yeah. Like Cynthia, you've brought up like helping the consultant understand your organizational culture, right?
Yes.
I have found that having standing check-in meetings, right? Usually every 2 weeks, sometimes every 1 week or every month, depending on the type of the project and, you know, where we are in the process, has been incredibly helpful. I've also realized some clients, they have a culture in their office of sending emails and getting immediate responses. Right? They think it's instant messaging, right?
Yes.
That was never my practice when I had a job, and it's absolutely not my practice now as a consultant. I'm not sitting at my desk waiting for emails to come in, but that kind of thing has to be communicated, right?
Yes.
You've got to understand that, you know, you're bringing together organizations that might have really, really different communications practices. What else works or doesn't work?
Can you speak a little more about that, Peter? Because that's really important. And oftentimes people will engage consultants to work on that communication, to work on that response time. What is acceptable as an internal employee and then as a consultant?
You know, I mean, so personally, as an internal employee, I also thought it was a better practice in terms of productivity to try and batch responding to emails. Like, I'm not super disciplined about it, but I don't have an alert on my screen distracting me every time I receive an email, right? I just can't get my work done that way. With clients, what I'm really realizing I have to do is spell that out in their onboarding package to understand that it might be 24 to 48 hours before I respond to them. Because sometimes I'm on site with different clients, right? Sometimes it's a writing day and, you know, all my devices are put away and, you know, and things like that. So, you know, you shouldn't panic if you're not hearing back in a couple of hours. Yeah. And that's another reason why it's so great to have those check-in meetings. So ideally, the need for urgent communication should be reduced if we all know what we're working on this week.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a same methodology in that I host a kickoff meeting and I have a list of things that I ask the clients. One is what are your organizational cultures that I should be aware of? Two, how do decisions get made in your organization? That's important. One thing that I learned the hard way is who is the buyer?
Oh.
I'll tell you when this becomes an issue. When you do strategic planning, and so you have the board highly invested in that work, but you have the ED and the staff that run the organization, right? And then there's a conflict. Well, who exactly is the buyer here? It has come up. So that's been that's been a little tricky and a learning experience. Also, when I do some project management, I have a liaison, a staff person I speak to all the time. but major decision needs to be made. Now I have to figure out who's the ultimate decision maker, right?
Yeah.
So liaisons and decision makers could be two different people. So these are learnings that I'm getting along the way.
Mhm.
And hopefully the work, makes it easier. But one thing that I'm hearing is that the three of us tend to submit reports about our progress. I would love a report from the client about their progress. I've never
No.
required one. I think I should change that practice.
That's actually a great idea. I have a sprint report that I use when I meet with my clients.
Uh-huh.
And I could just ask them to write in their progress in a certain section of the sprint report before we meet. And that
Yeah.
report is a Google Doc that we use during the meeting, so we could both contribute to it.
Yeah. I like that idea.
That's a great idea.
Rebecca, you're writing
Note
notes.
Yeah.
I take notes most shows.
Yeah.
I get
Yeah.
more time today because I'm not doing comments, but
I love it.
Here's another thing that has come up for me in working with clients. It's like, how do you know when you're done, right? Or how do you communicate to your client that this is it and I'm leaving, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And ideally the deliverables and the end date on the contract happen exactly like we anticipated.
Mhm.
But sometimes I've actually completed deliverables early, right? And sometimes contracts have to get extended. So the end date can be a little bit muddy, right?
Mhm.
One of the things that I have found is really helpful is continuously reminding the client and making sure we're on the same page about what the deliverables are, right?
Yes.
You know.
That's so important.
Yeah, right. And bringing them up and saying, okay, so that one is done. And now we're moving on to this one, right?
Yeah.
So they sort of understand, they can see their progress. What else is helpful?
What I run into a lot is, oh, well, Rebecca, I know we were working on this grant, but we found this other one too.
Yeah.
And there is a significant difference in the type of grant you apply for. So, for example, a federal contract or a state grant contract is a different contract for me than a private foundation grant application.
Right.
And so I always am very upfront about, well, these are the application types. And if you change the application type or, find additional grants, then we have to consider that. Now, that being said, if we have identified a private foundation funder and then we decided not to apply, obviously we want to replace that with another. But I guess what I'm getting at in all of this is communication and not catching your clients by surprise and being very firm about, here are the expectations that I can deliver on, the accountability, and what happens in a what if scenario. If you build that rapport and the conversation or communication up with your clients, like, for example, Cynthia, you were talking about who's the buyer and decision maker, then depending on the relationship, you should be able to work through those pretty easily. But I think when we wait on those conversations or we're uncomfortable about talking about changes, that's when you get that pushback. And then the project, I find, is just a struggle from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I work with clients that have internal conflict, as I'm sure many of us do. And I am struck by the way that internal conflict gets in the way. And so, no, that's it. You can take it off. I said this.
I was going to say, and then we solve it, and here's the process.
No, sometimes we don't solve it because it's not in the contract to solve your conflict.
Actually, I would say all of our clients have some internal conflict.
Yeah.
That goes back to our initial point about, when you bring in a consultant, and it is generally, it is often at a growth point in your organization.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You are leveling up something in your organization that you don't have the capacity yet internally to manage it. and I always say, like, designing something and building something is harder than running a process that's already been documented. So
Yes.
often you're bringing in the consultant to build something that you're going to hand off to your staff. By definition, this is sort of an uncertain and uncomfortable time in your organization, and there's going to be some change going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Two things that I think about is one, clarity around the end product, right? So
Yeah.
I've been on the other side and I used to hire a lot of consultants. And in the very beginning, I wouldn't understand that what I was getting was a plan to execute. And so, of course,
Oh,
when
yeah.
I'm having this conversation, at first, I'm here thinking that the work will happen as the
Right.
consultant is there. But what they're doing is building a knowledge base and synthesizing information, putting together best practices, and now I have a plan. And I'm like, oh my, I just spent all this money for a plan and it's not even done, right?
Yeah.
And the expectation is that I am going to do it. So I find that to be, so that has stayed in my head. And when I work with clients, I am constantly reminding them. So for instance, in strategic planning, you get a plan, right? I also did an evaluation plan for an organization. And I made it very clear throughout all of our communication, you are getting a plan. Implementation is an add-on, right?
Right.
So that they wouldn't be surprised at the end of the project and say, wait a minute,
It wasn't done.
we've done nothing.
And when you're, those distinctions in the way we normally work are not all that clear, right?
Yeah.
We usually we have an idea and we sort of start implementing it, and then we plan the next phase, and then we implement that, and right, and it's just kind of all continuous, right?
Yeah.
And so it really takes some thought discipline to see the difference between paying a consultant for a plan versus paying a consultant to do a thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Another thing I think we should also be mindful about is that you should not let a consultant walk away with this new knowledge or with any knowledge. An organization should build a transition plan internally so that whatever the consultant has done gets diffused to its staff.
Yeah.
So that when the consultant leaves, you're not like, oh my, how do we do that? Right? But make sure that there are one or two people that know what the consultant did and can continue the work. Because you also don't want a consultant there forever.
Well, that's when you cross over to, am I a consultant or employee? And when I'm hired, oftentimes there's not communication internally of who did what and where's the grant and how much did we get, where's, what's the status. And so a lot of what I do also is sifting through the information that is available to help sort out some of that detail, because a lot of organizations that hire development consultants don't know how to read the products they produce, because there's so many different hands in the production. And so oftentimes it's just making sense of the web of information. And, I find.
Oh, did she freeze or is that me?
No, she froze.
Oh,
she's back. Okay, good.
Sorry. I was just going to say that the more that I can explain and educate my client, the more confident they feel when we transition away from the project. Now, once the project's completed, I oftentimes will phase my work. Then they may rehire, because ultimately you would like them to rehire, right? Or go on to retainer. And so that there's this nice buildup and flow of work, because what we're trying to create is a portfolio that they can draw from, almost like a library. And I would imagine it'd be the same in your work as well, because they're constantly reproducing the same information, maybe just in a different way.
Yeah, that's always the goal, is to hand it off.
Yeah. Right. And so I think there's a distinction between the types of consultants. My goal is to help you build an infrastructure strong enough so that you never have to call me back.
Oh, okay.
Right? With you and your work, it makes a lot of sense, right? That if you are successful, or that you brought tons of value to to their organization that they bring you back. So it does differ, but dependency on me, for me, is not a good benchmark. I actually I love to talk to organizations a year and a half later, and I have not spoken to them since, and they're telling me all this great stuff that they're doing as a result of our work together, versus somebody who calls me over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have clients who call me back a few years later, right? So the goal is you should never call me for that particular problem again.
Right.
But sometimes they call back a few years later and they're like, that went so well. We got another round of funding and now we have to expand our evaluation plan. Like, that's great. Right? When we get to the point where we've just got to level up and then get back to where your staff can run it again, right?
So you're saying something. So there's a distinction there that's really important. You talked about growth, bringing in consultants when you're in the midst of growth, versus, and so that's totally appropriate given the example that you gave, versus creating a dependency on this person and constantly bringing them back without you really internalizing the learning.
Right.
Again, this means that I potentially left with this knowledge and no one at your
then you didn't really get good value.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's good
I look at it like, well, this is Grants 101. This is, intro to
Grants
grant
201, right? But if someone calls you for like a local grant and then a state grant and then a federal grant, like they are level. Yeah.
And it makes sense too, because organizations, unless you know something I don't know, you don't usually dive right into a federal grant. You have to build up that capacity. And so it's really interesting how we're each able to identify and distinguish the differences in our roles.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. I wonder, maybe we do a follow-up and we bring on a leader, or we bring on one, maybe two leaders and hear their experiences working with consultants. That would be interesting. That would be really interesting. All right. Well, almost to time.
Last thoughts? Cynthia, do you have closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think that clarity on what the product is really important, so that you can manage your expectations and make sure that you also plan to internalize the new learnings so that it doesn't go away with the consultant.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to be able to articulate to the consultants. So what are we going to be able to do, right? And how are we going to hand this off to us so that we can keep doing it? Yeah. How about you, Rebecca?
Well, I find, it is a significant investment in hiring a consultant, and there may be a couple of rounds of discussions of whether this is a right fit. And so being patient as the consultant and free with the information that the client needs to make that informed decision is really important. And I also, though, want to push organizations to let them know that it is okay to take that risk. And the struggle that you feel right now, I think you said it to me one time, Cynthia, that's a struggle today, but it doesn't mean it's a struggle forever. How do you put that when you were talking about you said to me one time about something that's present now, that if you just bring this resolve, make this investment, then you won't have that later, or you'll be better equipped later. So take the risk and invest in a consultant and interview a couple of them.
Yeah. And I think one thing we've made clear is you're going to talk to this person a lot, and they're going to engage with a lot of your staff. They are potentially going to have to train people to run the systems that they've implemented. So you should like them. Right? You're gonna be in a sprint meeting with them frequently, or a coaching session frequently. You're going to talk to them frankly about your organization's culture. You're going to be very honest about your organization's limitations. You're going to manage through things that don't go the way you expected. And, remember that every single consulting project is happening for the first time ever. So it's probably not going to be perfectly smooth, and you're going to have to negotiate through that, right? So hire somebody that you're going to be comfortable managing through all that with.
I love that. We should talk the next episode that we have about this. We should talk about fit.
Yeah.
When do you know it's fit?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're done.
Have a
Hour
great
30.
weekend, everybody.
Great weekend.